The Situation Room at Model's headquarters in Oosterbeek was filled with the controlled chaos of a military command managing a crisis that was rapidly turning into an opportunity. Field Marshal Walter Model stood before the operations map, studying the positions of Allied airborne forces that had landed across the Netherlands 3 days earlier in what was clearly a major offensive operation. Around him, his senior commanders and intelligence officers were assembling a picture of the Allied plan and, more importantly, its weaknesses. The headquarters had been hastily relocated from Arnhem when the first British paratroopers began landing dangerously close to Model's previous command post. Staff officers had evacuated files and communications equipment in confusion, uncertain whether this was a raid targeting the field marshal personally or part of a larger operation. Within hours, as reports accumulated from across the Netherlands, the scope of the Allied offensive had become clear. This was an attempt to seize a corridor of bridges leading to and across the Rhine, an audacious plan that could, if successful, outflank Germany's western defenses and open a route into the Ruhr industrial heartland. Model had recovered quickly from his initial panic and had begun organizing the German response with characteristic energy. The field marshal was known for his aggressive defensive tactics, his willingness to commit forces rapidly to critical points, and his ability to improvise effective countermeasures against Allied operations. He had commanded armies on the Eastern Front, where such skills were essential for survival, and now he applied them to defending the Netherlands against what he recognized as a potentially war-winning Allied operation. General Wilhelm Bittrich, commander of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, pointed to the map showing British airborne forces isolated at Arnhem, American airborne divisions holding bridges at Nijmegen and Eindhoven, and British ground forces attempting to advance north along a single road. The Allied operation, ambitious in scale and bold in conception, was beginning to unravel because of coordination failures, logistical constraints, and German resistance that had proven more effective than the Allies had apparently anticipated. Model had initially believed the airborne landings were an attempt to capture him personally and had evacuated his headquarters in panic. But within hours, as intelligence reports clarified the scope and objectives of the operation, he had recognized it for what it was, an attempt to seize bridges across the Rhine and establish Allied forces north of the river, outflanking the Siegfried Line and opening a route into Germany's industrial heartland. It was an audacious plan that, if successful, could shorten the war by months. But Model had also immediately recognized the operation's vulnerabilities. The Allies were attempting to seize and hold multiple objectives along a narrow corridor stretching over 60 miles from the Belgian border to Arnhem. Success depended on capturing intact bridges, on ground forces advancing rapidly up a single road, and on airborne forces holding isolated positions until relieved. Any significant delay or failure at any point along this corridor would doom the entire operation. The field marshal had responded with characteristic decisiveness. German forces in the Netherlands, though battered by the summer fighting in France, included the 2nd SS Panzer Corps that had been withdrawn to refit. These units, though under strength, included experienced soldiers and capable officers. Model had ordered them to engage the airborne forces immediately, to contest every bridge, to prevent the link-up of airborne and ground forces that the Allied plan required. 3 days into the operation, German countermeasures were proving effective beyond Model's initial expectations. British forces at Arnhem were isolated and under increasing pressure. The bridge at Nijmegen, though threatened by American airborne forces, remained contested, and British ground forces advancing north along the corridor were making slow progress against determined German resistance and were falling dangerously behind the schedule that the airborne forces' survival required. General Hans Krebs, Model's chief of staff, reported on the tactical situation at each critical point.
At Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division had captured the northern end of the bridge but could not secure the southern end. German forces were systematically reducing the British perimeter, using armor and artillery against paratroopers who only had light weapons. The British would not hold much longer without relief. At Nijmegen, American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division controlled the town, but had not yet captured the critical bridge across the Wall River. German defenders, reinforced by elements pulled from other sectors, were holding the southern approach. The Americans would need significant help from British ground forces to take the bridge, and that help was still miles to the south. Along the corridor from Eindhoven northward, British 30 Corps was advancing, but at a pace far slower than the operational plan required. German forces, using the terrain effectively, were forcing the British to deploy repeatedly to clear resistance. The single road that the entire ground advance depended on became congested with vehicles, creating bottlenecks that further delayed forward progress. What should have been a rapid armored thrust was becoming a methodical, grinding advance. Model asked his intelligence officer to present the analysis of Allied command and coordination. What emerged was a picture of an operation that, while ambitious and well-planned in some respects, suffered from fundamental flaws in execution and coordination between the different Allied forces involved. The intelligence officer, Oberst Friedrich von der Heydte, a paratrooper who understood airborne operations from personal experience, explained that the Allied operation involved 3 different national commands: British airborne forces at Arnhem, American airborne forces at Nijmegen and Eindhoven, and British ground forces attempting to link up with them. These forces operated under different commands, with different priorities, and apparently inadequate coordination. Most critically, von der Heydte noted, the American forces seemed to be executing their portion of the operation with different priorities than their British allies. The 82nd Airborne had been tasked with capturing bridges at Nijmegen, but had delayed this mission to first secure high ground south of the city. This was sound tactical doctrine: secure your position before attempting difficult objectives. But it contradicted the operational requirement for immediate bridge capture that the overall plan demanded. Similarly, the 101st Airborne around Eindhoven had focused on establishing defensive positions and securing their drop zones before fully committing to bridge seizure. Again, this was tactically prudent, but operationally problematic. The entire Martin Garden Plan depended on rapid seizure and holding of all bridges simultaneously. Any delay at any bridge put the entire operation at risk.
Model absorbed this analysis with growing interest. He asked whether this reflected American military doctrine or American reluctance to take casualties in what was fundamentally a British operation. Von der Heydte suggested it was likely both. American training emphasized force protection and methodical operations, while American commanders might indeed be less willing to accept heavy casualties for objectives they saw as primarily benefiting British strategic aims. Bittrick added his observations from the tactical fighting. American paratroopers were skilled and brave soldiers, well-equipped and well-led at small unit level, but they appeared to be fighting their own battles rather than coordinating closely with British forces. At Nijmegen, the Americans had not immediately seized the bridge when they might have found it lightly defended. By the time they were ready to attempt the capture, German reinforcements had arrived, and the bridge was now a fortress. The field marshal walked to the window, looking out over the Dutch countryside that had become a battlefield. He understood that the Allied operation was failing not because German forces were particularly strong, they were cobbled together from various units and were significantly outnumbered, but because the Allies were not operating as a unified force. The British and Americans were conducting parallel operations rather than a coordinated campaign. Model turned to his commanders and articulated what he was seeing. The Allied operation had been designed by British commanders, primarily Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, to achieve British strategic objectives, crossing the Rhine north of the Ruhr and opening a route into northern Germany. American forces had been assigned supporting roles, but apparently without full commitment to the operation's success. The Americans, Model suggested, saw Market Garden as Montgomery's operation, a British plan that diverted resources from American objectives further south. American commanders, Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, wanted to advance on a broad front to maintain pressure everywhere rather than concentrating for a single decisive thrust. They had gone along with Market Garden, had provided 2 airborne divisions for it, but without the full commitment that successful execution required. This lack of unified commitment was manifesting in the tactical decisions that German forces were exploiting. American paratroopers secured their own positions before attempting difficult objectives. American ground force support for the airborne operations was minimal. American air support was being directed to other sectors rather than being concentrated on the Market Garden corridor. The British were conducting their operation while the Americans watched and provided grudging support. Krebs asked whether this assessment suggested that inter-Allied tensions were deeper than German intelligence had previously understood. Model responded that tensions always existed in coalitions, but Market Garden seemed to have exposed particularly sharp divisions between British and American strategic visions. The British wanted focused offensives aimed at decisive objectives. The Americans preferred broad advances that kept all armies engaged and prevented any single commander from dominating strategy. The Field Marshal outlined how German forces should exploit these Allied weaknesses, continued to pressure the British at Arnhem, where they were isolated without American support, contest the Nijmegen Bridge aggressively, forcing the Americans to pay a high price for its capture, delay British ground forces along the corridor, where American air support and artillery support seemed minimal, make the operation so costly that inter-Allied recriminations would follow failure. Model also noted the intelligence implications of what they were observing. If the Allies could not coordinate effectively for a single operation like Market Garden, how would they coordinate for the larger offensives that would be needed to invade Germany? The Wehrmacht was learning valuable lessons about Allied command relationships that would be useful in planning future defensive operations. Bittrick presented his plan for the final reduction of British forces at Arnhem. German armor would be brought forward despite the risk from Allied air power. The British perimeter would be compressed systematically. Surrender demands would be made offering honorable terms. The destruction of the British 1st Airborne Division would send a clear message about the costs of ambitious operations that lacked proper support. The discussion turned to the broader strategic situation. Market Garden's failure, which now seemed increasingly certain, would have consequences beyond the immediate tactical outcome. The Allied advance would be slowed, perhaps halted for weeks, while new operations were planned. Winter would arrive before the Allies could mount another major offensive. Germany would gain time to prepare defenses, to move forces from other sectors, to potentially launch counteroffensives. Model considered whether Market Garden's failure might create opportunities for more than just delay. Could German forces counterattack while Allied forces were overextended along the narrow corridor? The Field Marshal was cautious about such ideas. German resources were limited, and any offensive would need to achieve decisive results to justify the risk. But the possibility was worth exploring with higher headquarters. The conversation returned to the American role in Market Garden's failure. Von der Heyte noted that American military doctrine emphasized combined arms operations, coordination between ground and air forces, and overwhelming firepower applied systematically. Market Garden required something different: rapid, bold action, accepting high risks and potential heavy casualties to achieve time-critical objectives. This was more consistent with British operational culture than American.
American forces had executed their tactical missions competently. They had dropped accurately, had secured their immediate objectives, and had fought effectively when engaged, but they had not embraced the operational urgency that Market Garden required. They had been given missions supporting a British operation, and they had approached those missions with the caution and methodical planning that American doctrine emphasized.
Model observed that this reflected the broader American approach to the war in Europe. American strategy was based on material superiority, on building overwhelming force before attacking, on minimizing casualties through firepower and logistics. The Americans were willing to take time to prepare properly, to ensure success before committing forces. This approach had worked well in North Africa and Italy, and in the methodical breakout from Normandy. But Market Garden required something different. It required speed over security, boldness over caution, acceptance of risk over force protection. These were not American military virtues. The British, with their tradition of small professional armies operating on shoestring resources, were more comfortable with such operations. But the British could not execute Market Garden alone. They needed American airborne forces, American air transport, American logistical support. The result was an operation designed according to British operational principles, but executed by forces, particularly American forces, whose training and doctrine emphasized different priorities. The Americans were not deliberately sabotaging the operation. They were executing it according to their understanding of proper military practice. But that understanding was incompatible with what the operation required. Krebs suggested that this incompatibility was a structural weakness in the Allied coalition that Germany should exploit in future operations. If the Allies could not coordinate effectively, if British and American forces operated according to different doctrines with different priorities, then German defensive operations should be designed to widen these gaps, to force situations where Allied forces needed to support each other, but might be reluctant to accept casualties for Allied objectives. Model agreed, but cautioned against overestimating Allied dysfunction. The Americans and British had cooperated effectively enough to win in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France. Their differences were real but manageable in most circumstances. Market Garden was failing because it was an unusually risky operation that required perfect coordination. Most Allied operations would not be so demanding, and therefore would not expose these coordination weaknesses so clearly. The field marshal returned to the operational map and studied the evolving situation. British forces at Arnhem were fighting desperately, but were running out of ammunition and supplies. American forces at Nijmegen had finally launched an assault on the bridge using boats to cross the Wall River, a bold move that showed American tactical competence, but came too late to save the overall operation. British ground forces were still too far south of Nijmegen, unable to advance quickly enough to relieve the airborne forces before they were destroyed. Model drafted his evening report to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt at OB West. He described the tactical situation, the progressive reduction of Allied positions, the increasing likelihood that Market Garden would fail completely. But he also included analysis of Allied coordination problems, noting that American forces seemed to be fighting their own battles rather than fully supporting the British operation. This observation about American reluctance or inability to fully support British operational concepts was significant beyond the immediate tactical situation. It suggested that the Allied coalition, however powerful in aggregate, had internal tensions that affected operational execution. These tensions were manageable when the Allies were advancing against collapsing German resistance, but they became critical when the Allies attempted complex operations requiring precise coordination. As evening fell over the battlefield, reports continued to arrive of British forces at Arnhem being compressed into an ever smaller perimeter. The end was near for the British 1st Airborne Division. They had fought bravely, had held longer than many German officers expected, but they had been isolated too far from supporting forces and had been overwhelmed by German armor and artillery that their light weapons could not counter. Model reflected on the broader implications of what he was witnessing. Market Garden was failing because the British had designed an operation that required American support, but the Americans had not provided that support with the urgency and commitment the operation demanded. This failure revealed structural problems in Allied command relationships that might be exploited in future operations. But Model also understood the limitations of German ability to exploit these weaknesses. Germany was fighting a defensive war, reacting to Allied initiatives rather than dictating the operational tempo. Allied material superiority meant that even poorly coordinated Allied offensives might succeed sheer through weight of resources. Market Garden was failing because it was an unusually risky operation that required perfect coordination. Most Allied operations would be more straightforward and would succeed despite coordination problems. The Field Marshal convened his staff to discuss the next phase of operations. Market Garden was failing, but Allied forces remained powerful and would soon attempt other offensives. German forces in the Netherlands had performed well, had demonstrated that determined resistance could defeat even well-planned Allied operations, but casualties had been significant and replacements were limited. Every battle won was a battle that consumed irreplaceable German strength. Bittrick reported that the attack on the British perimeter at Arnhem would resume at dawn. The British would be given a final opportunity to surrender. If they refused, German forces would systematically eliminate remaining resistance. The bridge at Arnhem would be secured and could be used for German logistics. The destruction of the British 1st Airborne Division would be complete. At Nijmegen, the Americans had finally captured the bridge through a combination of boat assault and coordinated attack. German forces had contested every meter, but had ultimately been overwhelmed by American firepower and determination. The Americans had executed the mission, but too slowly to save the operation. British ground forces were still too far south to exploit the Nijmegen bridge capture before German forces could establish new defensive positions to the north. Model studied the casualty reports and force availability assessments. German forces had suffered significant losses but remained operational. Allied forces, particularly the British airborne troops, had suffered catastrophic losses. The exchange ratio favored Germany, but the larger strategic picture remained grim. The Allies could replace their losses. Germany could not. The conversation among the German commanders turned philosophical as they waited for the final reports of the day. They discussed the nature of coalition warfare, the challenges of coordinating forces from different nations with different military traditions. The Wehrmacht itself was not immune to such problems. German forces operated alongside Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and other Allied forces whose capabilities and commitment varied significantly. But the Allied coalition problem seemed different in nature. The British and Americans were both wealthy industrial democracies with professional militaries. They shared language and cultural heritage. They had been cooperating for years, yet they could not coordinate effectively for an operation like Market Garden. This suggested that the problems were not just practical, but reflected genuinely different strategic visions and operational cultures. Von der Heyte offered a perspective based on his study of American military operations. The Americans, he suggested, approached war as an industrial problem to be solved through superior production and logistics. They built overwhelming force, moved it methodically into position, and applied it systematically to destroy enemy capabilities. This approach worked, but required time and resources.
The British, by contrast, approached war as a strategic problem where clever planning and bold execution could achieve results disproportionate to resources committed. They emphasized surprise, deception, concentration at decisive points. Market Garden was a quintessentially British operation, ambitious, risky, designed to achieve dramatic results through clever maneuver rather than overwhelming force. These different approaches were not necessarily incompatible, but they required different tactical execution. Market Garden needed speed and risk acceptance that came naturally to British military culture, but were foreign to American doctrine. The Americans had participated in the operation, but had done so according to their own doctrinal preferences, which emphasized security and methodical operations over speed and risk. The result was an operation that fell between two approaches. It was too risky and too dependent on precise timing for American comfort, but it lacked the overwhelming force that American doctrine would have demanded to compensate for the risks. The British had designed an operation that needed British execution, but had depended on American forces to carry substantial portions of it. Model synthesized these observations into a broader understanding. Market Garden had failed not because of any single tactical error, but because of fundamental misalignment between the operation's requirements and the capabilities and doctrine of the forces assigned to execute it. The British had conceived an operation that required certain tactical behaviors. The Americans had provided forces but had executed according to different tactical priorities. The gap between conception and execution had doomed the operation. This analysis had implications for German defensive strategy. Future Allied operations would likely reflect similar tensions between British and American approaches. German forces should be prepared to exploit these tensions, to force situations where Allied forces needed to support each other but might hesitate due to different strategic priorities or concerns about casualties. But Model also cautioned against overestimating the importance of these Allied tensions. The fundamental reality was that the Allies possessed overwhelming material superiority. They could afford coordination failures and operational mistakes that would be catastrophic for Germany. They would learn from Market Garden's failure, would adjust their planning, would eventually succeed in crossing the Rhine and invading Germany. As night settled over the Netherlands, the operations room at Model's headquarters continued processing reports and issuing orders. The battle for Arnhem was entering its final phase. The broader Market Garden operation was clearly failing. German forces had demonstrated that Allied offensives could be defeated through determined resistance and exploitation of Allied coordination problems. But the victory was tactical rather than strategic. Germany had delayed the Allied advance by weeks, perhaps months. Germany had inflicted significant casualties on elite Allied airborne forces. Germany had demonstrated continued capability to mount effective defensive operations. Yet none of this changed the fundamental strategic balance. The Allies would regroup, would plan new offensives, would eventually break through German defenses because their resources were simply too great to be permanently denied. Model understood this with the clarity of a professional military officer who distinguished between tactical success and strategic outcomes. Market Garden had failed, and German forces deserved credit for that failure. But the failure was as much about Allied, particularly American reluctance to fully commit to a British operation as it was about German defensive effectiveness. The Allies had defeated themselves as much as Germany had defeated them. The Field Marshal drafted his final report of the day, documenting the tactical situation and providing his analysis of why the Allied operation was failing. He noted the lack of coordination between British and American forces, the different operational approaches they had taken, the failure to provide mutual support at critical moments. He suggested that these observations should inform future German defensive planning. But Model also noted in his private reflections that this victory, however satisfying tactically, did not alter Germany's strategic situation. The war was being lost through cumulative attrition, through the grinding down of German military capacity against Allied material superiority. Tactical victories like the defeat of Market Garden bought time but could not reverse the fundamental imbalance that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. The German generals had realized that Operation Market Garden had failed significantly because of American reluctance or inability to fully support a British operational concept. This realization provided tactical satisfaction and useful intelligence about Allied coalition dynamics. But it did not change the reality that Germany faced overwhelming enemies who, despite coordination problems, would eventually prevail through sheer material advantage. Market Garden's failure was a German success, but it was a success that delayed rather than prevented Germany's inevitable defeat.